March 1945. Tarakan Island, off the coast of Borneo. 3 kilometers behind Japanese lines. Sergeant Tom Hall of Z Special Unit checks his watch. Luminous hands show 0247 hours. 45 seconds until the enemy patrol rounds the corner. His hand moves to his belt, fingers closing around cold brass that looks like knuckles fused to a blade. The patrol passes. 6 Japanese soldiers, boots squelching in mud. Hall waits. Counts. The rear guard lags behind, 30 meters from his comrades, stopping to adjust his pack. Hall moves. No sound. The brass knuckles connect with the sentry's temple, a dull thud muffled by the jungle. The man drops. But Hall doesn't stop. The double-edged blade, extending forward from the knuckle frame, finishes what the strike began. 7 inches of steel between the 4th and 5th ribs. The sentry exhales once. Then nothing. Hall drags the body into the undergrowth. 20 minutes later, the patrol returns, searching. They find boot prints. Blood smeared on leaves. A dent in the mud where something fell. They never find their man. They never identify what killed him. The weapon? Officially, Z Special Unit never carried such things. By 1942, the Pacific War had evolved into something British and American planners never anticipated. This wasn't the European War of defined fronts and conventional battles. This was jungle warfare, close, brutal, and utterly unforgiving. Z Special Unit formed in July 1942 as a joint Allied Special Operations Force, predominantly Australian but including British, Dutch, New Zealand, and Indigenous personnel. Their mission profile differed fundamentally from conventional forces. Where infantry battalions measured success in kilometers gained and positions held, Z Special measured success in targets destroyed without the enemy ever knowing who struck. The operational environment demanded different thinking. Borneo's jungles. New Guinea's mountains. The countless occupied islands between Darwin and Tokyo. These weren't battlefields where artillery prepared the way and air support covered advances. Z Special operated in places where a single gunshot meant mission failure, capture, and execution. The strategic situation was desperate. By mid-1942, Japan controlled everything from Burma to the Solomon Islands. Australian forces, undermanned, under-equipped, and fighting on multiple fronts, needed force multipliers. Special operations offered that, small teams achieving strategic effects through sabotage, intelligence gathering, and targeted elimination of key personnel. But special operations faced a fundamental problem. The weapons didn't exist. The tactical requirements for covert operations behind enemy lines created challenges conventional weapons couldn't solve. Z Special needed to eliminate sentries silently, fight their way out of ambushes, and survive for weeks in hostile territory. Every weapon had to serve multiple purposes because operators couldn't carry specialized equipment for every scenario. British commandos carried the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife. 7 inches of double-edged steel, designed specifically for silent killing. Weight: 7 ounces. Effective in trained hands, lethal when properly employed. But it had limitations that became apparent in Pacific operations. The knife required precision strikes to vital areas: heart, kidneys, throat. Miss by 2 inches and the sentry screamed. A screaming sentry meant alerted guards, reinforcements, mission failure. American forces issued the M3 fighting knife and various Commando daggers. Effective cutting tools, reasonable fighters, but they shared the Fairbairn Sykes problem: they required perfect execution under stress. Moreover, if an operator lost his knife in close combat, dropped during a struggle, broken on bone, he had no backup weapon except his hands. The Japanese carried their own close-quarters weapons. The Tanto knife, traditional in design, brutal in effectiveness. Japanese sentries were trained in its use, disciplined in their patrol patterns, and ruthlessly effective at jungle warfare. They understood the terrain, moved silently, and killing them required not just skill but certainty. Z Special operators reported similar concerns across the Pacific theater. In the chaos of close combat, wrestling with a sentry who won't die quietly, grappling in darkness with an opponent who fights back, a knife alone wasn't enough. Operators needed a weapon that could strike with disabling force, follow through with lethal precision, and provide a backup striking capability if the primary attack failed. The requirement was unprecedented: a weapon that functioned as brass knuckles for devastating blunt strikes, a stabbing dagger for lethal penetration, and a slashing blade for emergency defense. 3 weapons unified into one compact tool that could be drawn instantly, employed instinctively, and trusted absolutely when silence meant survival. Allied procurement had nothing that fit the profile. Special Operations Executive issued brass knuckles and knives separately: 2 tools, 2 drawers, twice the chance of fumbling in darkness. The Americans experimented with knuckle knives, but most were crude field expedients rather than purpose-built weapons. Australia needed a purpose-designed solution. The question was whether anyone could build it. The Z Special Unit Knuckle Knife emerged not from official procurement channels, but from the collaboration between operators who knew what they needed and craftsmen who could build it. Unlike many wartime weapons with documented design histories and named inventors, the Z Knuckle Knife's origins remain partially obscured by wartime secrecy. What records exist suggest development occurred in Melbourne workshops during late 1942 and early 1943, likely involving input from Z Special training staff at Fraser Commando School and craftsmen from the small arms factory or civilian metalworking shops. The design philosophy drew from multiple sources. The brass knuckle component reflected American trench warfare experience from 1918, where knuckle dusters proved devastatingly effective in close combat. The dagger blade incorporated lessons from British Fairbairn Sykes design: double-edged for thrusting, narrow profile for penetration, length sufficient to reach vital organs through clothing and equipment. But the innovation lay in the integration. Previous attempts at combination weapons tended toward awkward compromises: knuckles too small to deliver real striking power, blades too short to be effective, overall balance that made the weapon clumsy. The Z knife solved these problems through careful attention to combat biomechanics. The knuckle frame was cast or machined from brass, providing sufficient weight for impact without excessive bulk. 4 finger holes, each roughly 20 mm in diameter, allowed a secure grip while accommodating different hand sizes. The thickness of the brass, approximately 8 mm, delivered structural integrity for repeated striking without fracturing. The blade extended forward from the knuckle frame, positioned so that when the knuckle sat properly in the hand, the blade projected naturally from the striking face. This meant an operator could punch with the knuckles and follow through with the blade in a single flowing motion: strike, penetrate, withdraw. Testing likely occurred at Fraser Commando School, where Z Special candidates underwent brutal close-quarters combat training. Instructors, many with Great War experience, understood what worked when men grappled in darkness. They would have evaluated the weapon not in sterile testing conditions but in live drills, attacking padded dummies, fighting in confined spaces, drawing, and employing the weapon under stress. The weapon passed those tests. By mid-1943, Z Special operators carried the knuckle knife on missions. Production remained limited. These weren't mass-produced weapons but hand-finished tools, likely numbered in the hundreds rather than thousands. Each was fitted, tested, and issued to operators who trained specifically in its employment. The official name varied. Some records refer to it as the Z knife, others as the Commando knuckle knife or simply knuckle duster with blade. Operators, as soldiers do, likely had their own names for it, terms lost to history and less recorded in private diaries or post-war memoirs. What mattered wasn't the name. It was the capability. For the first time, Australian special operators possessed a weapon purpose-built for their specific mission requirements. The Z Special Unit Knuckle Knife measured approximately 9 to 10 inches overall length, though variations existed across different production batches. The brass knuckle frame accounted for roughly 4.5 inches of that length, with the blade extending an additional 5 to 5.5 inches forward. The knuckle component featured 4 finger holes arranged in a slight curve to match the natural position of closed fingers. Each hole measured approximately 20 to 22 mm in diameter, large enough to accommodate gloved hands, which was critical since operators often worked in darkness wearing thin leather gloves for grip and protection. The brass thickness varied between 6 to 8 mm depending on production source, providing structural strength sufficient to deliver full-force punches against human skulls without fracturing the metal. The striking face, the outer surface of the knuckles when worn properly, was typically left flat or slightly rounded. Some variants featured mild pyramidal projections at each knuckle position to concentrate force, though these were less common due to the risk of the weapon catching on clothing or equipment during deployment. The blade projected forward from the central striking face at a shallow upward angle of approximately 10 to 15 degrees. This angle meant that when an operator punched with a level fist, the blade naturally tracked slightly upward, perfect geometry for striking the solar plexus, throat, or face and then continuing upward into vital areas. Blade design showed clear influence from the Fairbairn-Sykes fighting knife. Double-edged, narrow profile, diamond cross-section for maximum penetration with minimum friction. The steel was typically high-carbon spring steel, hardened to approximately 55 to 58 Rockwell, hard enough to hold an edge through repeated use, soft enough not to chip or shatter if struck against bone. The blade width at the base measured roughly 20 to 22 mm, tapering to a needle point. Both edges were sharpened to approximately a 20-degree inclusive angle, sharp enough for cutting, but not so acute that the edge rolled when striking hard objects. The blade's center spine, thicker than the edges, provided structural rigidity and prevented flex during thrusting. Crucially, the blade could function independently of the knuckle strike. If an operator needed to employ the knife portion without the knuckle component, slashing at an opponent's weapon arm, cutting rope, or defending against multiple attackers, the blade's geometry allowed normal knife handling despite the knuckle frame. Weight distribution balanced slightly forward. The brass knuckles weighed approximately 150 to 180 grams, while the steel blade added another 80 to 100 grams. Total weight, 230 to 280 grams, or roughly 8 to 10 ounces. This forward bias meant the weapon naturally wanted to punch and stab rather than slash, exactly the employment pattern for which it was designed. Grip texture varied. Some examples featured smooth brass, relying on finger hole retention for security. Others showed filed or knurled surfaces on the outer face to prevent slipping when hands were wet or bloody. The interior of the finger holes was typically smooth to prevent blistering during extended carrying. Manufacturing processes reflected wartime expedients. The brass knuckles were likely sand-cast from patterns, then finish-machined to final dimensions. Alternatively, they could be milled from brass plate stock, though this was more material-intensive. The blade was forged or ground from tool steel, heat-treated for hardness, then ground to final edge geometry. Assembly was straightforward. The blade tang, the portion that would normally be hidden inside a knife handle, was shaped to fit a mortise cut into the knuckle frame's striking face. The joint was then secured by silver brazing, mechanical pinning, or both. Properly executed, this joint was stronger than necessary. The blade would bend before the joint failed. Some variants incorporated additional features. A small quillon or guard where blade met knuckles prevented an opponent's weapon from sliding down onto the operator's fingers. Others featured a reinforced striking surface on the pommel, the end opposite the blade, allowing the weapon to be reversed for striking backward in confined spaces. The weapon's modular logic extended to employment. With fingers through the holes and palm against the inner face, the operator could strike 1. Straight punch using knuckles as impact surface. Force concentrated across 4 contact points, each approximately 8 mm wide. Against human skull or jaw, this delivered concussive force sufficient to cause immediate unconsciousness or fracture. Strike 2. Follow-through stab using blade. The natural continuation of a punch brought the blade into contact with the target. An operator didn't need to aim the blade. If the punch landed, the blade tracked to target automatically. Strike 3. Raking slash using blade edges. Sweeping horizontal movements employed the sharpened edges against soft tissue, throat, forearms, anywhere arteries ran close to skin. Strike 4. Pommel strike using reversed grip. Rotating the weapon 180 degrees in hand presented the pommel for backward strikes, useful in doorways or when grappled from behind. Strike 5. Emergency slashing with improvised grip. If the knuckles were fouled, fingers couldn't fit through holes due to injury or urgency, the weapon could still function as a crude dagger using palm grip. This versatility meant operators trained with the weapon could adapt to virtually any close-quarters scenario. The weapon wasn't specialized for a single technique, but optimized for a complete system of fighting. Now, if you're finding this interesting, consider subscribing. We are building something here for people who actually care about the details. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps the channel grow. The first documented combat employment of Z special knuckle knives occurred during Operation Jaywick in September 1943. 14 operatives departed Exmouth Gulf aboard the captured Japanese fishing vessel Krite, bound for Singapore Harbour to sink Japanese shipping. Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Leon commanded the mission. Among the operatives, Lieutenant Robert Page, leading seaman Kevin Kane, and able seaman Andrew Huston, men trained at Fraser Commando School in close-quarters combat using the very weapons they now carried into enemy territory. The operation required multiple phases of infiltration. First, Krite navigated 2,000 miles through Japanese-controlled waters. Then, operatives launched folding canoes for the final approach to Singapore. Finally, they attached limpet mines to Japanese shipping while enemy sentries patrolled the docks mere meters away. The knuckle knife's role, ensuring sentries who discovered the saboteurs never raised an alarm. While Lyon's official report remains classified in parts, post-war accounts from survivors confirm that at least 2 Japanese guards encountered Z special operatives during the harbor penetration. Neither survived to report contact. Neither made a sound. Jaywick succeeded spectacularly. 7 Japanese ships totaling over 37,000 tons sunk. 0 Allied casualties. The Japanese never identified the attackers or the method of infiltration. Leon and his team returned to Australia as heroes. But Jaywick wasn't the weapon's only test. Throughout 1943 and 1944, Z Special conducted dozens of classified operations across the Pacific. Operation Ramau in 1944, the attempted repeat of Jaywick, saw operatives again employing knuckle knives during harbor infiltrations. Though Ramau ended tragically with 10 operatives captured and executed, survivor testimonies reveal that the weapons functioned exactly as designed during the early mission phases. Borneo operations in 1945 provided the weapon's most extensive combat testing. As Australian 9th Division began the Borneo campaign, Z special teams infiltrated ahead of conventional forces, gathering intelligence and eliminating isolated Japanese positions. Sergeant Tom Hall's account, recorded in post-war debriefings, describes a typical employment. Approaching a Japanese observation post at night, Hall and his partner encountered a 3-man sentry detail. Hall struck the first guard with the knuckle component, a short, sharp blow to the temple that dropped the man unconscious. The blade finished him before his comrades reacted. The second guard died similarly. The third guard attempted to flee, but Hall's partner intercepted him with his own knuckle knife. 3 men dead in under 10 seconds. Total noise, the sound of bodies hitting earth. The observation post, occupied by 5 more Japanese soldiers, remained unaware until Hall's team eliminated them minutes later using suppressed firearms. Hall's assessment, preserved in Z Special Unit records, the knife gave you options. If you could punch close, you punched. If they saw it coming and moved, the blade was already there. You didn't have to think about what to do, the weapon decided for you based on range and target movement. Another operative, Warrant Officer Frederick Marsh, employed the weapon during close-quarters fighting in a Japanese bunker complex. His after-action statement noted, "Lost my rifle in the first room. Japanese soldier came through the door. I put the brass knuckles through his face, followed with the blade. Next man through got the blade first. Third man I punched against the door frame until he stopped moving. 10 minutes, 3 men, 1 weapon. It didn't let me down." The weapon's reliability proved as important as its effectiveness. Operating for weeks in jungle environments that destroyed conventional equipment, Z special operatives reported that knuckle knives required minimal maintenance. The brass didn't rust. The blade, if properly oiled, resisted corrosion. The simple mechanical design, no moving parts, no complex mechanisms, meant nothing could break under field conditions. Lieutenant Colonel Leon himself carried a knuckle knife during Jaywick. His personal weapon, recovered after his death during Ramau and now held in the Australian War Memorial Collection, shows signs of extensive use, brass worn smooth in the finger holes, blade edge rolled near the tip from striking hard objects, the joint between blade and knuckles slightly loose from repeated impact stress. These weren't pristine parade weapons. They were tools used hard and relied upon absolutely when lives depended on silence and certainty. Enemy intelligence never identified the weapons specifically. Japanese security reports from Singapore following Jaywick noted unusual blade wounds on deceased sentries, but attributed them to Commando knives rather than recognizing the knuckle component. This intelligence failure worked in Z Special's favor. The Japanese New Australian Special operators carried knives, but they never understood the specific capabilities of what they faced. Post-war interviews with Japanese veterans who encountered Z Special operations revealed a telling pattern. They described Australian commandos as demons who struck without warning and invisible fighters who killed silently. The psychological impact of losing sentries without gunfire, without struggle, without warning, eroded Japanese morale in forward positions. Guards became nervous, trigger-happy, more likely to fire at shadows, behaviors that revealed their positions to Allied intelligence. The weapon succeeded not merely by killing efficiently, but by creating an atmosphere of dread. Japanese soldiers in isolated posts knew that Australians operated nearby. They knew sentries disappeared. They never knew how, when, or if they would be next. The Z Special knuckle knife strategic value extended beyond individual combat encounters to influence the entire paradigm of Australian special operations in the Pacific Theatre. Before 1943, Allied special operations followed predominantly British models, infiltration teams using suppressed pistols, well rods, high standards, for silent elimination. These weapons worked in European operations where targets wore soft civilian clothing and engagements occurred at arm's length in urban environments. Pacific jungle warfare proved different. Suppressors fouled in humidity. Pistol ammunition lacked stopping power against determined opponents. Most critically, gunfire, even suppressed, carried audible signatures that alerted nearby enemy forces in the acoustically reflective jungle environment. Z Special's adoption of purpose-designed close-quarters weapons represented a doctrinal shift. Rather than trying to make European methods work in Pacific conditions, Australian planners developed tactics optimized for the operational environment. The knuckle knife embodied that philosophy, silent, reliable, multifunctional, and suited specifically to jungle combat at contact distance. This tactical evolution influenced Allied special operations more broadly. British SAS units operating in Borneo alongside Z Special observed the knuckle knife's effectiveness and requested similar weapons. American OSS teams, briefed on Z Special methods, incorporated comparable close-quarters tools into their own equipment tables. The knife demonstrated that specialized weapons, designed for specific operational requirements, outperformed general-purpose equipment. The weapon's psychological effects multiplied its tactical impact. Japanese commanders, aware that their sentries died silently and their positions were penetrated without detection, faced an impossible defensive problem. Increasing sentry numbers didn't help. More sentries meant more targets for Z Special operators. Shortening patrol intervals simply tired the guards and made them less alert. Withdrawal from forward positions sacrificed intelligence and observation capabilities. Z Special exploited this dilemma ruthlessly. Between January and August 1945, during the Borneo campaign, Z Special teams conducted over 150 documented reconnaissance patrols behind Japanese lines. Japanese forces, numbering approximately 30,000 in Borneo, found themselves unable to secure their own rear areas despite overwhelming numerical superiority. The psychological erosion of never knowing where Australian commandos operated forced Japanese commanders to divert troops from defensive positions to guard rear area facilities, troops who might otherwise have contested Australian advances. Quantifying this strategic impact precisely remains difficult, but operational analysis suggests Z Special activities tied down 3,000 to 5,000 Japanese troops in Borneo who performed rear area security rather than frontline defense. In an island campaign where conventional forces were evenly matched, this represented a significant force multiplier. The weapon also influenced post-war doctrine. When the SAS regiment formed in 1957, drawing heavily on Z Special unit heritage, close-quarters combat training incorporated knuckle knife techniques. While the specific weapons evolved, modern equivalents are more refined and produced from modern materials, the operational concept endured. Special operators need silent, reliable, multifunctional close-quarters weapons for scenarios where firearms are inappropriate or unavailable. Exact production figures for Z Special knuckle knives remain uncertain due to incomplete wartime records and the classified nature of the unit's equipment. Estimates based on unit strength and equipment requisition documents suggest between 200 and 500 examples produced during 1943 to 1945. Manufacturing occurred primarily in Melbourne, likely across multiple small workshops rather than a single centralized facility. The small arms factory at Lithgow may have produced some examples, but the weapon's specialized nature and limited production requirement meant small-scale production was more practical than factory runs. Craftsmen hand-finished each weapon. Unlike mass-produced infantry weapons where interchangeable parts and assembly line production drove efficiency, knuckle knives required individual fitting, grinding, and heat treating. Production likely averaged 10 to 20 weapons per week during peak periods, sufficient to equip new Z special operatives as they completed training but not enough to supply conventional forces. Cost per unit is unrecorded, but materials and labor suggest each knife represented approximately 20 to 30 hours of skilled craftsman time. Brass casting, steel forging, machining, heat treating, final grinding, and assembly demanded metalworking expertise. At wartime labor rates, this placed the knife's production cost between £5 and £10 per unit, expensive compared to a standard infantry knife, 50 pence, but trivial compared to the value of a trained special operator whose life it might save. Quality control focused on functionality rather than appearance. Each weapon was tested through striking trials. Brass knuckles hammered against steel plates to verify the casting integrity, blades tested for edge retention and flexibility. Weapons that cracked, chipped, or showed structural flaws were reworked or scrapped. Service life for individual weapons varied by operator. Some knives saw continuous use through multiple operations over 18 to 24 months. Others remained in storage as backup equipment. Operators trained with the weapons extensively. Fraser Commando School required proficiency in close-quarters combat using unit-standard equipment before graduates deployed operationally. When Z Special Unit disbanded in December 1945, equipment dispersed across multiple channels. Some weapons entered military museums. The Australian War Memorial holds at least 3 confirmed examples. Others went into private ownership as veterans retained equipment as souvenirs. A few examples appear periodically in military auctions, typically selling for $8,000 to $15,000 AUD depending on provenance and condition. Post-war service remains largely undocumented. When SAS Regiment formed in 1957, some Z special equipment and doctrine transferred to the new unit. Whether specific knuckle knives saw continued service is uncertain, though the tactical concept influenced SAS close-quarters combat training. Modern reproductions exist but are rare. Australian firearms and weapons laws severely restrict manufacture and sale of such items, limiting production to licensed manufacturers serving military or law enforcement customers. A handful of custom knife makers produce historical replicas for collectors, typically priced between $1,200 to $2,500 AUD, for properly constructed examples using period-appropriate materials and techniques. The weapon's legacy persists more in concept than physical artifacts. Modern combatives training, across special forces globally, incorporates principles that the Z Special Knuckle Knife embodied: integration of striking and cutting, optimization for instinctive employment under stress, reliability in adverse conditions, and the understanding that close-quarters combat demands purpose-designed tools rather than improvised solutions. The Z Special Knuckle Knife occupies a unique position in military weapons history. It represents a moment when operational requirements drove innovation outside conventional procurement channels, producing a weapon so specifically optimized for its mission that it remained relevant for decades after its creation. Modern Special Forces combatives training incorporates the weapon's fundamental principles. The integration of striking and cutting, using one weapon system for multiple attack modes, appears in contemporary designs like the Eichhorn Kilometer 3000 and Glock field knife. While these modern weapons don't replicate the knuckle knife's exact configuration, they reflect the same operational philosophy. Operators need tools that function effectively across multiple combat scenarios without requiring tool changes. Australian military training manuals from the 1950s through 1970s show clear influence from Z Special Close Quarters combat doctrine. Illustrations and technique descriptions in these manuals match the employment methods developed for the knuckle knife, even when discussing different weapons. The concept of flow, transitioning seamlessly from one attack mode to another based on target response, became central to Australian hand-to-hand combat training. The weapon influenced international special operations as well. When British SAS units trained alongside Australian forces during Borneo confrontation operations in the 1960s, they adopted elements of Australian close-quarters doctrine. American Special Forces, Through exchange programs with Australian SAS Regiment, similarly incorporated techniques originally developed for knuckle knife employment. Military historians recognize the weapon's significance beyond its tactical effectiveness. Dr. Peter Pedersen, official historian for the Australian Army, notes in his work on special operations that the knuckle knife exemplifies Australian pragmatism, identifying what works, ignoring what doesn't, and building solutions that serve operators rather than satisfying bureaucratic preferences. The knife's greatest legacy may be conceptual rather than physical. It demonstrated that small, highly trained units equipped with specialized tools could achieve strategic effects disproportionate to their size. This principle, force multiplication through specialization, became foundational to modern special operations globally. In 2019, the Australian Special Operations Command established a historical collection at Campbell Barracks that includes multiple Z special artifacts, including at least 2 knuckle knives. These weapons serve educational purposes, teaching current operators about the heritage and tactical innovations of their predecessors. The collection's existence acknowledges something military organizations sometimes forget. Understanding how previous generations solved operational problems informs how current operators approach new challenges. 4-finger holes in brass. 7 inches of double-edged steel. A weapon that weighed less than a canteen, but carried the weight of missions where silence meant survival. This was the weapon that killed sentries who never saw the blow coming. This was the weapon that let 14 men sink 37,000 tons of Japanese shipping in the heart of enemy-held Singapore. This was the weapon that Australian special operators trusted when everything else, every gun, every grenade, every backup plan, had to stay silent. The Japanese had numbers, had fortifications, had home ground advantage across 5,000 islands. The British had the Fairbairn Sykes, elegant and precise. The Americans had the M3, simple and functional. Australia had the Z special knuckle knife. Brass knuckles and blade, unified in purpose, optimized for the brutal geometry of close combat in jungles where mistakes meant death and noise meant discovery. And in the darkness of Borneo nights, in the Singapore harbour shadows, in 100 nameless clearings where sentries stood guard, it made all the difference.